Today's show comes to you in the full quantum of I don't know the result of my subjects today. So we're going to talk about inflation, Ukraine, and truckers. There's stuff happening as we speak. So it's actually kind of fun, the Schrodinger cat aspect of it all, because I get to make predictions in real time and you can actually check them when we're done. So you can see how accurate things are. So this show is all about relationships. It's all about our relationship with money, and it's about breaking up with those relationships that aren't fruitful for money, right? Not every relationship we have is fruitful, and not everything is going to help us get to where we want to go. So today, with all that's going on in the world, with the stories that we're going to be covering, with the Fed secret meeting, with Ukrainian press conference about to happen, with Trudeau in Canada and the convoy invoking emergency measures in order to take the money. All of these aspects fall into one really important propaganda tool, and that's what I want to talk about today. And it was actually the Super Bowl ad from last night, the FTX Super Bowl ad, that had me think about this as a subject for today. So I'm sure a lot of people have been talking about this FTX ad today, but I want to just tee it up from my perspective to show you why it was important, why it was significant, and why it actually suggested that we're getting over this terrible affliction we have with this propaganda tool called the Gell-Mann amnesia effect, which we're going to discuss. So why and how was the FTX ad related to Gell-Mann amnesia effect? Well, the FTX ad with Larry David showed a person throughout different times in history, an Egyptian saying what a stupid idea that wheel is. And then he was a monk who said what a dumb idea a fork is. And then, he said you can't go to the moon, and a dishwasher is a dumb idea, and all these things were stupid ideas. And then finally, he's there talking about crypto and saying, it kind of sounds dumb, right? So the point here is that you know and can recognize when a friend or a person or a direct contact, someone you're in direct contact with, P2P contact with, is telling you a lie. When someone exaggerates too much or embellishes stories, if they're your friend and if you have real world contact with them, you end up saying, well, that person's an exaggerator. I don't really take that person seriously. I can't trust what that person says, right? Now, that's an effect we can all recognize, right? Whenever you have a friend who's known to embellish, known to tell a lie, known to say things that are exaggerated, you discount that person's opinion, right? Now, this effect of discounting a person's opinion when they have a history of getting things wrong, weirdly, strangely, never applies to the media. It never does. And the person who first recognized that was a man named Michael Crichton. Now, Michael Crichton needs a second on this show, and just in general, that all Bitcoiners should stop and acknowledge this fella. He'd have been the biggest Bitcoiner in the world. He just died a little too young for us. He died just after Bitcoin came into reality. If you don't know who Michael Crichton is, let me just educate you just for one quick second, because I love the guy. So Michael Crichton, you probably know his most famous work, Jurassic Park. He was a writer of science fiction stories. So he wrote Congo, Jurassic Park. The Andromeda Strain was his first real hit. He was actually a medical doctor before all of that stuff. He was a Harvard-trained medical doctor, a literal giant, about 6'9", a literal giant, and was a real polymath, good at almost everything, and an expert in so many subjects you can't even imagine, right? Just every little subject. Throughout his life, he was friends with most American presidents. They would just call him in and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? He wrote a debunk of the media's role in global warming already in the 1990s in Playboy magazine. And I encourage all of you to read it. It's called Aliens Cause Global Warming. Now, provocative title, but you really got to get into it because it has nothing to do with the science of global warming. Although he wrote a book on the science of global warming, by the way. He was so interested in it and so up to date on all of it that he wrote his own book describing what would happen and if we had to worry or not. And his science actually holds up. He wrote that book in about 2004, and a lot of it actually still seems pretty accurate today. So he coined this Gell-Mann amnesia topic years ago. He called it Gell-Mann. This is a funny part too. He called it Gell-Mann because Gell-Mann was a physicist, a world-renowned physicist that he was just chatting about the subject with. And he said, Murray, like you're an expert in physics and you fell for this trick. So he ended up using the Gell-Mann name just to give credibility to his own idea, right? It had nothing to do with him. He was like, I throw in the name of this super famous physicist because it gives my theory credibility, the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. Gell-Mann has nothing to do with it. He's just a physicist. It's just a famous name, and that's it. So Michael Crichton writes, this is probably the best definition of Gell-Mann amnesia. Briefly stated, the Gell-Mann amnesia effect is as follows. You open the newspaper to an article on some subject you know well. In Murray's case, Murray Gell-Mann, in Murray's case, physics. In mine, showbiz. In his case, all those Jurassic Park shows. You read the article and see the journalist has absolutely no understanding of either the facts or the issues. Often, the article is so wrong it actually presents the story backwards, reversing cause and effect. I call these wet streets cause rain stories. The paper's full of them. In any case, you read with exasperation or amusement the multiple errors in a story, and then turn the page to national or international affairs and read as if the rest of the paper was somehow accurate. You turn the page and you forget what you know. So what he's basically saying is you get an expert who sees a subject, knows the journalist talking about it or the expert being quoted, everything's out of context, it is not a useful article, and you say, wow, that's ridiculous. And then you turn the page, right? And then you turn the page. So with the FTX ad we saw last night, what they're actually saying here, what they're actually telegraphing, what they're actually suggesting is that crypto people, Bitcoin people, all these folks, you can't really advertise them or market to them in the old-fashioned way. You've got to use these tricks of P2P and show that the people who have been doubting all this time are just wrong, right? And that credibility that comes from being right all the time is really worth something. And the disdain that you get from being wrong all the time is really worth something. And I think Bitcoiners, and this is sort of the cause and effect of the Gell-Mann amnesia, the more expert you are on a subject, right, the more the credibility of the expert journalist goes down, and it becomes this sort of give and take, right? So the more expert you become, the more obvious it is an article to you is silly. And this relationship then doesn't perpetuate when you turn the page and go on to another subject. Now, Bitcoiners have a truly remarkable protection against this, because moving from Super Bowl ads right away to inflation. Now we know the Federal Reserve is meeting, emergency meeting today. What's going to happen? We've been talking about it for weeks. Are they going to raise? Are they not going to raise? We don't know. Nobody knows, right? So what I'm suggesting is the P2P system in Bitcoin exposed the fraud of Gell-Mann amnesia when it came to interest rate hikes, finance news, economics news about the Federal Reserve. It sort of exposed that all these stories, are they going to raise rates? Are they not going to raise rates? Quoting all these experts, were really relying on this amnesia effect, right? It only made sense if you didn't remember what happened yesterday. And we could actually see that in 2019, the Wall Street Journal decided to ask a bunch of senior economists to make interest rate predictions for the following 12 months. So they said to all these big economists, you tell us what's going to happen in the next 12 months. They put it all in context. Well, Trump has a trade war and there's going to be this kind of stuff. The economy is going to be hot. They're going to have to raise. So every one of them said this many hikes. What ended up happening was 0 hikes. So every one of those economists got it wrong. And the news reported on it, every one of their predictions, for months, right? They waited with bated breath each and every time, but they never happened. So Bitcoiners have seen this trick for a long time now. They see that when you try to rely on social amnesia, when you try to write a series of stories that forget what happened yesterday, it doesn't go anywhere. That's why Bitcoiners have such love for the Bitcoin obituaries, for the articles that predict from mainstream media, Bitcoin's dead today. So Bitcoiners and any article about Bitcoin were able to notice the Gell-Mann amnesia effect, almost inoculating them, right? Almost inoculating them. Because what ended up happening was they started seeing it in other fields, right? So it wasn't just in interest rates and financial news, although that opened it. That was the beginning of the window of light that came in. So Bitcoiners had this great ability to be able to see beyond what was going on. And in the end, this starts to become quite humorous, right? Because Bitcoiners were able to see beyond this, they're kind of prepared for what's going on. They don't require this amnesiatic effect in order to continue to take the news seriously. Now, yesterday on Jon Stewart's podcast, he calls it The Problem, right? Jon Stewart's The Problem. He had the former KC Fed chair in, Tom Hoenig, and they were talking about money, right? They're talking about inflation. They were talking about what's going on in the market. And this seemed like it was all news to Jon Stewart. So this is what Jon Stewart said. It makes sense. So he had asked this guy, Tom Hoenig, the former chair of the KC Fed, what is all this printing going on? How much was it? And they agree it was $6 trillion that were generated and created by the Federal Reserve. And so Jon Stewart's sitting there asking him, he said, what is this all about? And, the former chair is trying to explain it to Jon Stewart. And then Jon Stewart finally goes, it makes sense in the make-believe world of conjuring. Like there's a certain part of this that all seems like a mirage. It all seems sort of fake. And Tom Hoenig says it's a fiduciary system. It's all faith-based, right? It's all faith-based, right? Jon Stewart says, oh my Lord, you have to have confidence in the currency. And then Jon Stewart replies again, it's a mass delusion, right? Mass delusion is probably a bit much. He's a comedian, don't forget, right? He's a comedian, so he's adding that comedic layer into it. But the truth is, Bitcoiners have been laughing about these guys for a long time. You can actually take any press release from the Federal Reserve mentioning future interest rates and insert the words methadone and treat it all like a heroin addict, that this heroin addict is planning on getting off of their addiction in 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. And it reads exactly the same, right? You can actually subtract all those words, put in methadone and heroin instead of Federal Reserve and rate hike, and you'll get the same article. They read the exact same, right? The exact same. So Jon Stewart laughing here that this whole thing is a mirage is something Bitcoiners have been saying for a long time, right? There is no amnesia for Bitcoiners because they understand the P2P nature of the network. They don't need a third party to come in and tell them it works this way or it works that way. It kind of takes away the confusion about all that stuff. You don't have to rely on anyone to tell you what's going to happen in the market tomorrow, just like we don't really need to rely on the market today to tell us if there's going to be more interest in the US dollar. Flatten the word interest for a second. We've been thinking about the word interest in terms of rate hikes and the interest and the overnight lending rate. The truth is Bitcoiners' new interest just meant simply no one's going to be interested in the US dollar as time goes forward. It's losing its attractiveness, right? It's losing the desire that most people would have to have it, right? The demand for the dollar is what a lot of Bitcoiners suggested is going away. And if you look at the second story here on Ukraine, right, on Ukraine today, you can start to see that that is playing out, right? So in Ukraine, they have all the Russian issue with Ukraine today looks like now, so it's this quantum again. So a few days ago, they said, Ukraine said, I guess this morning or last night, they don't want to join NATO. Now, this all started because months ago, Russia gave a series of terms to Ukraine saying, don't join NATO. You're not allowed. That's what we want. We won't cause you any trouble if you don't join NATO. Now, the rest of NATO is saying, we didn't really ask Ukraine, but Ukraine said yesterday, we don't really want to be in NATO. But now Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is saying today, well, maybe we do want to be in NATO, but we don't know. So everyone's now waiting for Zelensky to give a speech. But Zelensky is also a comedian, right? Zelensky was a comedian before he was the president. I'm not sure a lot of people know that. So Zelensky was a comedian, then he became the president. So this comedian Zelensky comes out in a press conference today and says, look, media, you seem to know way more about this than I do. I know I'm just the president of the country that is going to be invaded, apparently. But if you have more information, please bring it to me because I just don't see what you're seeing. Right? Day after day, I don't see what you're seeing. Now, in the same P2P nature, right? Bitcoiners, we know a lot of Bitcoiners, and Ukraine is one of the countries with the most Bitcoin per capita in the world. So we all know people in Ukraine. So we can't, in my case, really rely on the news for what's going on. I lived in South Korea during the years that the nuclear bombs were being tested, or at least the second nuclear bomb was tested. I was there. Everyone called me, Nolan, what's going on? Are you in imminent threat of a nuclear attack? I didn't even know what they were talking about. I understood North Korea had tested a bomb. I knew a lot of the journalists that crossed and covered it, but it wasn't something that I thought was a clear and present danger to me in that day in Seoul. So I contacted my friends in Ukraine recently just to find out if they felt the same. Now, I'm not saying this anecdotal evidence proves anything. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when I spoke to them, they said, I don't know what the media is talking about. It's just not there, right? So maybe they're totally wrong. Maybe they're totally wrong. But this idea that the media 2 days ago said there was an attack imminent, Zelensky even made a joke. Like I said, he's a comedian. They even know the time it's coming. Please tell me if the time changes. I have to know if the time changes. If my country is being attacked, please tell me. So Zelensky, right, is adding a bit of the comedic effect here, and sort of saying that you got to follow these people. They said yesterday it was one thing. Now today it's a different thing. And he's definitely playing that game too and changing. But nevertheless, remember that anyone who is close to the subject of Ukraine on the ground is sort of saying it's not really there. I'm not saying it's not going to be there. It could still be there, right? But where I'm sitting right now, I'm continuing to predict nothing there, nothing there. And the last story I have to follow today, and this one really is incredible. And we're going to try and end it with a joke too, some laughing, because right, we get to laugh a little bit with Jon Stewart on inflation. We can laugh a little bit with Zelensky in Ukraine. Is there anything funny about the truckers? What's funny there? Is it related to Galman amnesia? Well, here. So the Canadian Prime Minister has now moved to take all the money, right? We've known that for a while. We've been talking about that for a while. We kind of hoped for that here on the show because we knew it would be a great orange pill moment. Not that I want anyone's money to be taken from them, but nevertheless, it's one of those situations where you warn someone enough that they're going to get burnt. And then when they get burnt, it's nice to say that you're right, at least in warning them, right? So I think a lot of Bitcoiners are there, and we've said, be careful for years, right? These banks are going to turn. They're going to do things that you would think only belong in a banana republic, but are actually in your great Western countries that are supposedly beyond all this stuff, right? So here's what happened. Canadian banks, this is what the Prime Minister said, Canadian banks are monitoring financial activity very closely and taking action as necessary. Today, that Prime Minister has decided to invoke the Emergency War Measure, basically the War Measures Act, right? The Emergency Powers Act. The reason he has to do that is because a few days ago, the state, the province of Ontario, applied for a special disposition allowing or prohibiting any person from disposing of, dealing with, or in any manner whatsoever, all monetary donations made through blah, 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 go, send, go, or whatever that thing was called. So whoever was issued, and any and all parties, right, had this injunction. You couldn't give money and they would take it away. Now, what does that say? So why are there two things? Why is the Canadian Prime Minister, federal Prime Minister, taking emergency action when this provision a few days ago, section 490.8 of the Criminal Code said we can go do this? Well, the reason is the thing on Friday, the Ontario Attorney General and the court that said it is actually under the supervision of higher courts. This could have been struck down very easily because it's obviously unconstitutional. The other court in Ontario, the other court in Ottawa said only the noise of the honking is what's illegal, right? Only the noise of the honking is illegal. The protest is fine. The injunction, the only thing that is illegal in any of these protests is honking. You can't honk anymore, right? And it looks like it's more or less being adhered to. The act of protesting is fine, right? It's completely fine. And so what this other court gave as this injunction against the financial considerations only really had a few hours in it, because another court, with what was clearly laid out in the injunction against noise, saying the protest was totally fine and legal. And a protest that requires finance, any protest requires finance, so the financing was inherently legal. So the motion that was given the other day probably would have got struck down immediately. Therefore, that's why you need the Emergency Measures Act in order to take the money, right? You can't just do it one after the other. And what makes me laugh here is that, we got guys in Bitcoin, there's this guy, JP Conning. He's been around for a long time, knows everything about Bitcoin, apparently, worked for the central bank in Canada. I think he writes for CoinDesk sometimes now. He's like a stable coin guy, I guess now, and a CBDC guy, kind of a policy wonk from Canada. I follow him because he puts these really cool pictures out of old coinage and old bills, and he's like of the specie of the money itself, right? He's a historian and that stuff, and quite useful. But this is what he said. He tweeted this: I don't see how Bitcoin is a viable alternative funding route for the truck convoys nonprofit. The same judge who issued the restraint order on the Give, Send, Go can also issue one on its Bitcoins. Route closed. Disposing those funds is now an offense. So his whole argument is that it's an offense, and it's an offense. That's what's preventing everyone, apparently, according to an expert. That's what's preventing anyone from using Bitcoin as a viable means to get around what is clearly government overreach. Apparently, it's an offense, and that's enough to persuade people, right? So here's another fella relying on Gell-Mann amnesia, right? That you would just be an idiot to not understand that we're all criminals anyway if we're in Bitcoin. That was already the case years ago, right? We knew we were criminals years ago. The way the laws were written. I lived in New York City for years and dealt with Bitcoin. I was always a criminal. Always. There's nothing else that I was. Everyone ignored it, but we were all criminals, technically, right? Technically. So here's a guy like JP Conning, degrees up the ass, knew about Bitcoin years ago, still telling you to forget what you know, right? Bitcoin doesn't care about an injunction from a court. Are you kidding me? That's the point, right? That is the actual point, that it is unseizable. You can't take it from someone, right? So why would anyone sit there and say, oh, well, we can't give in Bitcoin now because, geez, the nonprofit might lose their money. Oh my goodness, right? No one's saying that in Bitcoin. Nobody. It's not even a point. It's nothing to do with anything. We would love for them, the authorities in Canada, to start trying to take the Bitcoin. That would be humorous indeed, right? That would be a good time. So let them try and do it. So in the end, this Gell-Mann amnesia, right? What the FTX article reminded us is that you don't have the amnesia when it's friends. You don't have the amnesia when it's P2P, right? You don't have the amnesia when you have a direct relationship with the person lying to you. You get the amnesia when a third party enters the equation. When a third party enters the equation and says, you got to do this, you got to do that, this is what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen. And then they get everything wrong and you just ignore it and you move on and do it again, right? The media enjoys this unique ability, but it's waning. It's losing the ability to do that. And my bet is that the actual hinge upon which Gell-Mann amnesia works is financial media, is these ridiculous predictions about the economy that fail and don't come true one day after the other, again and again and again, and will not for a long time. We're on Bitcoin's schedule now, and we're on the schedule that Bitcoiners predicted years ago. Didn't matter that COVID was there. They predicted interest would never be high again in the dollar. And when I say interest, I mean no one gives a shit. No one wants it. Demand's down, right? And that would not stop. That would not stop. It doesn't matter what people say on TV, on CNBC. It doesn't matter what they say in that seance today they're having at the Federal Reserve, right? Interest just won't be there tomorrow. And my bet is interest in Bitcoin will be higher tomorrow than it was today. And if we can close the gap on this amnesia, if we can open people's minds to having the flexibility to change, not fill in the blanks just because someone gave you the information, we'll be that much closer to ending this misery and getting on with our lives. So that's the episode today. Gell-Mann amnesia. Don't forget.